So I'm very glad and honored to be here again. And I'm talking about, not the same things, but very similar things that I also did 2 years ago. It is about this perspective of a country that is both within Europe, on the one hand, but not within the European Union, on the other. And this is somehow relevant in a time when these two things, these two words, are being equated. When you say Europe, you mean the European Union. When you say the European Union, you mostly mean Europe. So I like to start my slides usually with this picture. This is a picture of the government building in Sarajevo after the war. And you can see these two flags, one from Bosnia and Herzegovina, the other from the European Union, sort of trying to mask all of this conflict and destruction that has been left behind. And this is basically what's been going on for the past decade or a few decades or so. That these two entities, European Union on the one hand and the state administration on the other hand, have been trying to sort of overcome the legacy of this conflict. Now, it has not been going too fast, and it has not been going on a very smooth line. And often, especially Bosnia, but the Western Balkans in general, are described as a laboratory for European Union foreign policy. All the sort of things that have been invented as European Union foreign policy have first been tested in the Western Balkans, and in particular in Bosnia and in Kosovo. So, as an introduction on what we're going to talk about, one thing is the European Union as a cohesive international institution, something that you can see from the outside. And when you come from outside Europe, whether it's from the US, whether it's from China, whether it's from South Africa, you see the European Union more or less as a whole, as some actor that you can communicate with. On the other hand, you have this internal view, and this is what you can see when people from Italy, from Germany, and from the UK talk about the European Union. It's a continuously evolving community of states, where you have values and institutions that you then somehow build and rebuild. And especially with Eastern Europe gaining more influence within the European Union, you can see this push to rebuild these institutions again. And finally, you have this something in between, this perspective that is both outside and inside, of countries that are somehow on the process, on the way of joining the European Union, but can still not influence the institutions of Europe as such. They're both looking at Europe as a whole, as an actor with whom they communicate, but at the same time trying to find their place within the European Union. And this is this sort of, maybe you could call it schizophrenic perspective that the countries in the Western Balkans have to deal with these days. So, very briefly, to introduce Bosnia and Herzegovina to you who don't know too much about the country. So it's a country with a very complex institutional structure. It has 3 or 4 levels of governance, more or less federal governance, with a division of competences amongst these levels. The state level has very little competence. Most of the competences are on a sub-state level, meaning from social policy to labor policy and so on. So most of this happens at the sub-state level. Then you have a multi-ethnic society, which is differentiated mostly based on religion. There are the three main religions, so Catholicism, Orthodox Christianity, and Islam are all present in the country, and the most of the population is divided amongst these 3. And this has been historically the case for hundreds and hundreds of years. And more recently, in terms of institutional structures, you have power sharing amongst these groups, which are defined by religion. And this has been the case for over 20 years since the war ended. So it is a post-conflict society, both within the country itself, where you had conflict between the communities, but also towards neighboring countries, which had a very large influence on the war in Bosnia, mostly Serbia and Croatia, Montenegro to a little bit lesser extent. And at last, you could say that it is an unconsolidated democracy. You do have elections are regular, they're more or less free and fair, but you cannot speak of a very consolidated and secure democracy in the country. It is something in between. So this is where Bosnia is on the map. It's pretty close to Italy, it's pretty much surrounded by the European Union as such. So it takes about an hour to fly to Bosnia from Torino, but there are no direct flights. And nevertheless, it has sort of a special place because in the minds of people in Europe, when you say Bosnia, people would locate it somewhere beyond Turkey. So it's somehow on a strange place that it is considered part of Europe, but very, very far from everyday concerns and very far from people's minds. The second part of the introduction is this European side. And here basically Bosnia is also stuck in this conceptual sort of discourse between European integration and European enlargement. So if you look at the European integration of Bosnia, it's pretty well advanced. So we're part of the energy community, we're part of the higher education area. You can just list all of these segments of European integration, and Bosnia is part of this. Customs unions, there's a sort of link between the European customs unions and the Balkan customs union. And the connections there are pretty much stable. But in terms of European enlargement and becoming institutionally part of Europe, basically nothing has happened so far. And this question whether these two are same or different and how one leads to the other is one of these sort of overarching questions that people in the region have to deal with. Even though you are becoming more integrated within Europe, you're not really becoming part of it. In this case, you can look at the European foreign policy at enlargement as part of a European foreign policy towards this region. Every segment of European foreign policy that is directed towards the Western Balkan countries includes this perspective of enlargement. You can find it in the introduction, at the conclusion, somewhere in between. People always mention this perspective in any foreign policy documents, but they don't see it as something that's definite. They always look at it as a process, something that's ongoing, in order to foster European integration, in order to foster the enlargement of the European Union, blah, blah, blah. So it's always sort of a way to do something. It's not a definite answer in terms of how the European Union looks at it. And within this, there's always this question of what you want to achieve through this European foreign policy. What is the aim of this enlargement and accession talks that are currently ongoing in just about all countries except Kosovo for the moment? So this current enlargement portfolio of the European Union basically focuses on the 6 countries of the Western Balkans, and again a map to just show you the current state of the European Union in terms of all its relations. I think you know why the United Kingdom is pink. It's been pink for 2 years. And we'll see how it is, what color it will be in 4 months, 5 months. The countries of the Western Balkans, Kosovo is yellow because it does not have any signed documents with the European Union. The Stabilization and Association Agreement is a first step, but it's not taken any second steps in terms of becoming part of the European Union. Bosnia-Herzegovina is on its way to becoming a candidate, while the other 4 bluish countries and Turkey are already candidates and either negotiating or about to start negotiations. In this sense, the European Union has set itself, the Western Balkans, as a priority for enlargement. No matter how weak this priority currently is, because there's no definite set of institutions within the European Commission to deal with enlargement, there's no dedicated portfolio. But all the members around these 6 countries that are sort of left out are part of the European Union. In the region, more specifically, Croatia is a member since 2013, so for 5 years. And Slovenia is already 14 years in as a member of the European Union, Bulgaria and Romania a little less. The thing is that all of these countries have a clear European perspective and a commitment of future EU membership. And this has been repeated over and over again for the past 15 years, since the Thessaloniki summit in 2003. This European perspective that eventually at some point in time these countries will become part of the European Union is more or less a given. And this is something that policy takes into account. Now, the things and the possible narratives that drive this sort of focus are different, and people relate to this sort of membership perspective in a different way depending on which of these narratives they decide to adopt. So some people talk about the missing piece of the European puzzle. And if you look at the map, it's sort of a grey area in the middle of Europe, which makes sense. Some people talk about it as the soft underbelly of Europe, mostly looking at outside powers, be it Turkey, be it Russia, be it China, that can take advantage of a European country to gain influence in European markets and possibly even disrupt Europe from within, so to say. And there's also this perspective of a possible powder keg. Because of the conflict in the 1990s, the Balkans are seen as a possibility that the region might go back to conflict eventually if it's not well integrated into Europe. And these sort of differences between Balkan countries, they're still there. So Croatia and Serbia, they regularly exchange sort of diplomatic threats. The same goes with Albania and Serbia. Bosnia is a whole different story, and Kosovo as well. It's more internal, but you still have this animosity within the groups, within the ethnic groups and nations of the region. So there are two sort of sets of questions that I want to talk about. One is about institutions, the other is about society and perceptions. And then we'll see how we can possibly link these two, if there's any way to do this. So, in a sense, when we talk about institutions, we can talk about some relations that are complex on the one hand and that are long-lasting, that have been ongoing for a long time. And these relations between the European Union and Bosnia-Herzegovina, and I mean, you can exchange Bosnia with basically any country of this region, be it Serbia, be it Macedonia, all countries work in this equation. The relations between these two entities, they can best be viewed as a process, something that's pretty much ongoing all the time. It's not just crisis management that happens in one point. It's a continuous negotiation on policies, be it from agriculture, be it from standards on meat production or on production of apples, quality of apples and so on. But it's something that's really ongoing all the time. So when you look at the institutions of Bosnia-Herzegovina that communicate and coordinate with the European Union, there's a whole set of them. So we have a dedicated directorate for European integration. Other countries have ministries for European integration that are directly located within the government of the country. And the directorate is basically accountable to the Council of Ministers, which is the government of Bosnia-Herzegovina. And this link, you can find it basically in almost any case. Serbia has its Ministry for, I think, External Affairs and European Integration. Macedonia has the same. It's a very important part of policy making, that you have a whole office, and these are hundreds of people who only work on a single thing, and that is relations with the European Union. As I said, Bosnia is a complex country with multiple levels of government, so you also have sub-state governments that are included in this relationship with the European Union, and that try to communicate their policies and their preferences through a very complex coordination mechanism that we have, which is divided across policy areas, and which then includes people from ministries below the state level. So, for example, on energy or agriculture, there's no agriculture ministry at the state level in Bosnia, none at all. You can find it at sub-state levels. And so you include these people when you need to make policy decisions on something that's much more technical. And then you try to coordinate between the different levels of the country to make a more harmonized policy. And basically this whole coordination mechanism as such, to deal with this multi-level governance, it was specifically set up to negotiate with the European Union. It's one of these products of having to deal, on the one hand, from the European Union with a complex country, and from Bosnia with having to deal with one single actor, to speak with a single voice. On the other hand, you have European Union institutions in Bosnia-Herzegovina. So those that, and this is a bit more specific for Bosnia, so you cannot really exchange this with, say, Serbia. And these institutions, they deal with European Union policy that is directed specifically towards the country as such. And so you have the European Union delegation, which is more or less an embassy of the European Union. But again, there's hundreds of people working there. You have the European Union special representative, in other words, the ambassador. You have a military mission of the European Union. It's small, but it's still ongoing, and you have soldiers, Austrian soldiers, Italian soldiers, German soldiers, and so on, stationed in Bosnia-Herzegovina as part of this mission. It's a remnant of the peacekeeping mission from the 1990s, where it basically had thousands and thousands of soldiers, and now it's just a few hundred. And previously you had others as well, such as the police mission. So there were European Union police officers who worked together with local police officers in basically creating a more safer environment and teaching them best practices. In terms of agreements that are signed between these two countries, and here you can also see this sort of institutional bond that has been ongoing. So there are readmission and visa facilitation agreements, interim agreements on trades and tariffs and trade-related issues, stabilization and association agreements, which is basically a first step towards potential membership. And currently we're in the process of finalizing a second round of a questionnaire for potential membership, which is going to happen sometime. You never know, really, because it takes long on both sides to make an agreement within Bosnia and for the European Union to reply. I mean, you can think of it as two sort of groups of people speaking with multiple voices, and until you figure out what each is trying to say, it just simply takes time. So this is a second step towards candidate status for Bosnia. And in this sense, you can also talk about the role of foreign policy preferences from both sides. From Bosnia, European integration is a priority in its foreign policy. And in this case, this goes true for basically all countries of the Western Balkans. That European integration and European Union accession in the potential future is something that they really are focused on working towards. Most other Bosnian foreign policy is very much closely linked to this single overarching goal. There are a few exceptions which I'll come to soon. But basically anything that's related to economy and trade, it's pretty much closely streamlined with the process of getting close with Europe in terms of trade relations, in terms of labor relations, and so on. The exceptions, they're mostly related to countries to which Bosnia has either some historical ties or has close cultural ties. Russia and Turkey are most important here. In this sense, some of our presidents, because we have 3 presidents in the country, as I said, it's a complex institutional structure, so the Serb member of the Bosnian presidency very often visits Vladimir Putin. And the Bosniak member of the presidency very often visits Recep Erdogan. And in this sense, you have this connection towards both countries that are seen as either outside protectors or close cultural allies. Economically, neither of them are important. It's more this cultural connection that matters in this sense. This is why, in terms of economic policy, you don't have close alignments, be it with Russia or be it with Turkey, but in everything else, from free travel, visa policies, and so on, you have very close ties with both of them. So if you would look at, flights from Sarajevo, most of them go to Turkey. Just the number of flights. And in addition to this, you have foreign policies of the European Union members towards Bosnia-Herzegovina. So from the individual member states, which are also very much defined by this enlargement agenda. And a lot of it is closely coordinated. That when ambassadors from European Union countries speak about foreign policy, they speak about similar issues. But there's also some independence within this. And you could see it in crisis situations, such as the migrant crisis in 2015, when Austria had sort of a different view on how you should deal with the Western Balkan route than other countries. And it took a much more forceful stance in negotiating with the countries, especially with Macedonia, but also with Serbia, Bosnia, around this issue. Now I'm going to shift to the second part, and this is about society and public perceptions. And public perceptions, they play a major role in how the European Union, but also how countries of the Western Balkans deal with enlargement, deal with this agenda of trying to integrate. And in the European Union, currently, as most of you are aware of, support for enlargement is pretty low. It's not even close to what it was in 2004. So around 40, this is just an average, so 42% support further enlargement, while 47% are against it. And the rest don't know. But here we can also see quite a significant division between so-called old members of the European Union and new members, mostly from Eastern Europe. So that most newer members are in favor of further enlargement of the European Union, and most older members in the West are not. Positively, you could see that support for enlargement is slowly on the rise again. So it was at the lowest point at the height of the economic crisis in Europe, around 2010-11. But since then, especially in the past 2 years, it's been slowly rising. And this is data from Eurobarometer, which is sort of a very reliable source on these issues. So in the chart, you could basically look at it like this, and you can make out these individual countries on where they stand. And if you look at the chart, towards the left-hand side are mostly Eastern European countries, while towards the right you can find most of these Western European countries from Austria, the Netherlands, Germany, France, and so on. And Spain is sort of an outlier on the one hand, and Italy is slightly less than the European average. But this support for European integration, it's pretty much divided. But you also have this sort of second part of the equation. Do countries from the Western Balkans want to become part of Europe? So it's not just sort of a one-way perspective of, when we let them in, they'll join, but they also have to be willing to do so. And support for this is not really that high anymore. So in Bosnia, it's 57% of people who support EU accession, but at the same time, not a large amount of people are against it. The percentage is only 11%. Most of them are actually undecided. And this number is growing the fastest. So they don't know if they want to become part of the European Union or not. They're not sure about this. They're not sure what the European Union will bring them. Specifically in Bosnia, you can see a significant difference in the two parts of the country. The Serb-dominated Republika Srpska is much more hesitant. Not against it, but much more hesitant in terms of not being decided on whether they want to join the European Union or not. While in this other part, called the Federation of Bosnia and Herzegovina, you can find much stronger support for European Union accession. And most of the skeptics, so not the ones against, the skeptics, they cite various fears of rising prices, of increased bureaucracy, of more competitiveness, and basically the economy of the country not being able to deal with the market pressure that is being forced upon it if they join the European Union as such. So this looks approximately like this for the past 3 years, and you have these surveys done at a regular interval. So the last time I was here, I presented the data for 2015, which was really good, so 76%, wow. And since then, it's just going downhill. So you can basically see that the support for European Union accession is dropping dramatically. At the same time, this negative attitude of not wanting to join, it's also dropping. What is rising is this huge indecisiveness, people just simply saying, but what will it bring us? What will we get? What will we lose? So it's not so much about people being against European Union accession or for it, but just simply wanting to know much more details about it and how it will affect their lives. Basically, EU policies are no longer taken at face value. And this is the same across the Western Balkans. So there are various sort of focuses of this Euroscepticism. One is economic, and this is closely related to the Eurozone crisis and how it's also sort of spilled over into the Western Balkans, because, as I've mentioned, we are closely sort of integrated into this European market. You have political divisions in EU countries, mostly this populism issue, and it's also been spilling over a little bit. This rise of populist nationalism is something that you can also see in the Western Balkans. You have a patronizing behavior of European Union institutions, basically saying you have to do this, you have to do this, you have to do this. and not explaining the rationale and the reasons behind it. It's just because I tell you so. And this has been ongoing for all countries, and people are just simply fed up with it. And at last you have identity threats, in the sense that some people see European Union values as a threat to their more traditional values. And especially more conservative parts of the population are very worried about this. Conservative and more religious parts of the population, they worry about this sort of identity threat that can be pushed upon them. So I'm going to present a few values from surveys, and one is a survey among youth in Bosnia-Herzegovina, but also in other Western Balkan countries. It's part of an externally funded project, so the total number of respondents was, I think, around 12,000, and for Bosnia it's about 1,000. So it's really just a survey across the whole Western Balkans. And when we say youth, it's a population between 16 and 26. So pretty much 16 and 28. So pretty much your age in some average, and much younger than I am. And the second is a poll taken in my class 2 years ago, just for around 30 students, where I asked similar questions, but the responses are also pretty much similar. So in a short, if you look at it, a very large percentage of young people, they do support Bosnia-Herzegovina eventually joining the European Union. And this hasn't changed too much. I mean, it's very high. If you ask young people, do you want your country to join the European Union? Most of them would say yes. But then again, 2/3 of them have sort of a balanced view of the European Union, both citing some positive and some negative things that might arise with membership. So they're much more well-informed and also much more demanding of knowing what this will bring them. So on a basic question, in terms of identity, is Bosnia a part of Europe? Most of them would say yes. About 2/3 of them would say yes. And those that do focus on this aspect of culture, of history, of geography, of being part of a single European space. Those that say no, then think a bit more specifically in terms of political relations, that they're not part of Europe. Now the question asked not EU or not Europe, but asked specifically, are you part of Europe as such? So you can already see that some students make this equation in their heads of European Union equals Europe and vice versa. From the 2018 survey, and this is across the 10 countries of Southeastern Europe, which include, by the way, 4 European Union member states and 6 countries which are not part of the European Union. The question basically looks at, how do you identify? Are you a national citizen or just a European? And a world citizen as such. So in this sense, Slovenia would be a country that best equates a sort of European, world and national sense of identity, while Albania, Kosovo and Bulgaria, which is part of the European Union, they much more force a national identity in relation to a European one. In this sense, you could see that there's no real dividing line between countries which are part of the European Union and those that are not. So, let me take the mouse over here. Slovenia is part of the European Union, Bosnia is not, and Croatia is, and Montenegro is not. And then you have Romania in the middle, which is, and Bulgaria again here, which is part of the European Union. And this line of EU national identity on how these two are related doesn't really correlate with European Union membership per se. A second question about joining the European Union and whether Bosnia should become a member eventually. There's just simply overarching support that it should. And you can see this again across all countries, with the exception of Serbia, which is a much more skeptic towards the European Union as such. And we can discuss this if you want to later. Why? In this sense, there's also no real division between being a member of the European Union and not. So Slovenia, which is a member for over almost 15 years now, is very skeptic, while Bulgaria, which has been a member for 13 years, is pretty much pro-European to a very large extent. And you can find the countries of the region sort of anywhere on this axis between supporting or not supporting the European Union as such. Now the question specifically says, Do you want to enter the European Union, or do you want to leave the European Union, depending on if the country is a member or if it's not? In terms of values and what this means, and how, this was specifically asked to my students, how do you associate yourself? What do you associate the European Union with in terms of values and perspectives? Most of them think of the European Union as sort of a jobs market. And I mean, this is sort of logical, because as a student, you're preparing yourself to do something, to do some work eventually. And you're already thinking in advance of where my profile would fit best. And in this sense, people think of the European Union as a much bigger jobs market than the tiny little one, the tiny national jobs market as such. Freedom of movement, closely related. Rule of law, also closely related. Most of these are also in relation to the country itself, meaning that something that the European Union has, and in which the country, in this case Bosnia, lacks. Some of them also cite sort of negative concerns, such as loss of identity or loss of autonomy, education, for those who make use of various Erasmus programs, security and stability, interestingly enough. So these two values on which Europe was founded, or which the EU was founded, they don't feature so prominently. They're not closely associated with the European Union any longer. And this chart, if you can make anything out of it, it looks at these values and perspectives across all of these 10 countries of Southeast Europe. And this line that goes through it in the middle is a ratio between employment and welfare as being important values, and freedom and democracy as being important values. And in this case, on the one hand, you have Serbia and Bosnia, where you have a very strong focus on economic values, and Slovenia and Romania, on the other hand, where there is much more focus on freedom as such. Again, there's no real dividing line here between being a member and not being a member of the European Union, but it is a bit more clear that when you become a member, economic concerns are not as important any longer. They're not prioritized to such a high extent. They still are very important, but not to such a high extent in relation to values of freedom, human rights, rule of law, and such. So it's a much more balanced view. And this is something that European Union accession and also the process itself definitely influences. This sort of more forceful push to prioritize values of freedom and democracy. Now there's a different question that also asks who you trust in terms of government. And specifically asking whether you trust the European Union government more than your own national government. Now in countries of Western Europe, this chart would more or less flip, and where people more trust their national governments than the European Union as such. While in the Southeast Europe, people have much more trust in the European Union than in their own national governments in all of these countries. And again, here you have no sort of division whether you're part of Europe, the European Union, or not. The country where there's the largest divide among young people between those who trust the European Union more than they do their national government is in Bulgaria. Right after that, Kosovo and Albania. While the country where people are sort of most level in terms of trust of their national European governments is Serbia, which is not part of the European Union. So you have this sort of disbalance that the national governments, in this sense, are not as much trusted as the European Union as a sort of governing body. And at last, I have a chart that looks at populism in terms of support for a strong leader. And here you can see some sort of division. As I said, the European Union, in terms of values, much more emphasizes values of freedom and democracy, and this also gets translated into this sort of support for a leader who rules a country with a strong hand. And here you can basically see that, with the exception of Serbia, the whole left part of the chart are members of the European Union, while the whole right part are not. And especially as countries consolidate their democracies much more and move towards a more stable democratic system, this support for a leader who rules the country with a strong hand, it sort of falls. It falls down. And the European Union definitely contributes to this stabilization of democracy in countries as such. So, to end up with a few quotes from my students. So, this is from 2016, and I think there should be master students now, or basically finishing their studies. So things that they were saying is Bosnia is my state and Europe is my second. Another one said the Europe is a rotting corpse of its former glory, basically relating to economic crises and to Brexit and all of this, what's going on. Another said that without expectations to join the EU, most of Bosnians would lose any hope for our future, and this goes basically for all young people in the Western Balkans. Joining the European Union within their sort of early lifetime is something that they definitely expect. The Western Balkan countries are historically and culturally a part of Europe, but in this new EU definition of Europe, we're excluded. And this pretty much sort of describes this whole inside-outside question of whether you're a part of it or not. And at last time for Bosnia becoming a part of the European Union, but we need to work really hard and make sacrifices to get there. So a pretty much realistic perspective on what is needed. To conclude this sort of division between societies and institutions, you can see this divergence between a societal perspective on Europe, where people feel that they're part of a whole, it's called Europe as such, an institutional perspective of Europe where they're excluded from being part of the European Union. So societally, people emphasize cultural similarity, shared values, a common history, and they see themselves as being firmly within Europe as such. But from an institutional perspective, they see themselves as excluded, external, somehow procedurally integrating, but also being patronized by European Union institutions. And they're definitely also perceive themselves as being outside of the European Union as such. Now the question, and we can discuss this also, is whether there is a possibility for a future convergence of this societal and this institutional perspective, basically through the process of European Union integration. And just to answer my own question, yes, but it's not that simple. So European Union enlargement is a political process. It takes time, and it is mostly shaped by domestic priorities, and not European priorities as such, but domestic priorities of each individual member country. So in this sense, public opinion on enlargement, it closely mirrors decision-making within the countries of the European Union, and electoral concerns, elections, and we know that within 28 member states you always have some election going on. There's always something that's a national electoral concern. They can definitely impede enlargement. They can slow down the process, they can stop it. As a second thing, you have EU policies and criteria. And most people think that once a country fulfills these technical procedural criteria, they should become part of the club. They should become members. But this doesn't really work that way. It's just the first step to get there. And it's much more important to also have the second part, this public support for being part of Europe. And you can see here that when you have societal ties, on the one hand, and this institutional requirements that work together towards a convergence, it makes easier to sell this political decision of expanding to domestic voters. And it's something that's very important within the European Union to try and to motivate domestic publics for further enlargement. So when you speak of enlargement fatigue, it's actually not a fatigue of the European Union as an institution, but it's a fatigue of the domestic populations of each individual country as such. What I showed you in the Eurobarometer for all the member countries, how much the population supports further enlargement. So, to wrap up, thank you very much. And I hope you have questions. If you don't, I have a few. If you need any sort of further readings on this, so the book, the article by Florian Bieber, it looks at this sort of trend of backsliding in terms of democratic governance in the region. The ones by Berzel and Grimm, they look at this difficulty to integrate the region institutionally within Europe. And a book that's coming out edited by Jankic, Kyle, and Kmezic on the Europeanization of the Western Balkans is definitely worth looking at. So I think it's available even now, even though it says 2019. So it definitely looks at how the European Union relates to each of these countries and across policy areas and how they try to work on it together. So thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Damir. This is the microphone, yes. So the floor is open. Yes, a question there.
I wanted to ask, hi, I'm Eva from Italy, and I wanted to ask which are the identity threats that Bosnia and Herzegovina people feel, because Bosnia and Herzegovina is already a multi-ethnic country, so it's a little difficult for me to understand this feeling that Bosnia and Herzegovina people have.
Okay.
Okay, so let's collect.
Sure, we can. Yeah, let's collect a few.
Yeah.
I'm Sabrina from Italy, and I would like to ask two questions mostly. And the first one is how this ethnic division versus religious division influence the government of Bosnia, and if this kind of structure in the state should be a good governance or not. And another question is if these cultural differences compared to this European identity you emphasized, especially in young people, maybe this identity, how can this identity influence maybe the future of Bosnia itself? Thank you.
Hi, I'm Tommaso from Italy, and I was wondering if Serbia has any special partnership inside of the Balkanic area or inside the European Union as for its foreign policies.
I'm Giulia from Italy, and I would like to ask you about the transitions that have been in Bosnia during the last few decades, as about the war and the ethnic cleaning, as we can say it, and what about the structure and the opportunities, but also the disadvantages about a difficult political process that was concentrated in this country, and the uncertain period. Is still there. Have we overcome it, or we are still in a period that is uncertain?
Hi, thank you. I'm Gaina from France and Argentina, and I would like to know, it's a bit similar to other questions, and it's not really linked to the European Union, but how are Muslims perceived in Bosnia after what happened in Srebrenica, and how do they perceive themselves, like in Bosnia, like if you have an idea?
from Italy, and I wanted to ask concerning the, let's say, how the trends are going in the Republic of Serbia in Bosnia, how the new movements and the rising movements with a nationalist footprint could actually influence the politics in the case, for example, Bosnia enters in the European Union, and wouldn't this bring even further a possible political union of the European Union?
Mm-hmm. Okay, one more and then...
Yeah, how many?
Which is good.
Mm-hmm.
Hi, I'm Letizia from Italy, and I will ask you how the tripartition of governments will dialogue in the future with the EU, not only about enlargement, but in a theoretical way and in practice. Thank you.
Okay. Damir?
So, okay.
Yes.
Okay, I think that it works now. Good. So I'll try to go through the questions one by one. If anything's unclear, just shout and make yourself heard. So let me see. Identity threats within Bosnia. This was a question by you. Could you just repeat it? Identity as a... sorry, too many.
My question was, I don't understand what's an identity threat for...
Oh, those identity... Okay. Identity threats in terms of the threats to a more conservative lifestyle. This is what I was talking about. So, it's not so much in terms of threats of religious value. It's not so much in terms of threats of migration, because this is something that we do not have, and religious values, sort of differences within religion, we had them for so long. So there's this sort of basic tolerance. You tolerate the person next to you. You don't like him, but you tolerate him. It's not really seen as so much of a threat. But Bosnia has a huge sort of conservative way of thinking about minorities, about women, about people of I don't know, of just simply difference. So it's one of the most homophobic societies in Europe. Bosnia and Serbia and Albania and Montenegro also, a little bit less, Kosovo especially. You have this huge sort of threat that you see coming from outside, which you don't see as part of your own society. And in this sense, when you say European identity threats, it's a threat of individualism, of the ability for every individual to express whatever they want in terms of gender preference, in terms of policy preference, religious preference. One of the biggest threats is seen as people switching their religion. So if you switch your religion, you also switch basically everything else. You switch your nationality and so on. And this creates a disbalance within all of these countries. So the threat is not so much threat from a group, but it's a threat from individualistic values, so-called post-materialist values, if you look at Engelhardt and Welzel. Something that the individual can express whatever they want in terms of identity, preference, and so on. And this is seen as a threat to a more conservative and closed and paternalistic sort of patriarchy and lifestyle that's very much ingrained in the Balkans. So, I guess that you could probably find similar things in any country and just then square it or put more emphasis on this, and then you would get what you have in the Balkans. A second one was how ethnic relation and differences influences Bosnia-Herzegovina. This was you, okay. So, in terms of good governance, it's pretty much ingrained, in Bosnia it's pretty much ingrained in the state structure itself. So you need to govern together. There's no way that you can force your own policies upon another group. They can always veto you. It's a basis of consociationalism, So I don't know how familiar you are with that term. It's Arend Leipjard and his whole sort of way of thinking. And it's not a Bosnian invention, by the way. It's something that you have currently in Belgium and in Switzerland, in a way, that you originally had in Austria and also, the Netherlands, but also in Austria. It's a way that you have to govern in a diverse society. So I wouldn't really say that it fosters good governance, but it fosters governance that does not result in conflict. So you can sort of try and weigh these two. Do you want governance with a lot of conflict that can potentially explode? Or do you want governance that's very slow and might sometimes not be ideal? And depending on your individual political stance, yeah, you choose one or the other. So Belgium has for decades chosen the more easier option to govern slowly, inefficiently, because they're a rich society, it doesn't really show that much. In Bosnia, where there's much less resources to be divided amongst these groups, it shows a lot more. And governance is much more sort of sloppy in that sense. So, I mean, I would always go for the option less conflict, even though that might take a longer time. Cultural diversity compared to European Union identity, that was you again? And yeah, I mean, if you would say that eventually the identity of young people as being European would prevail and become more important than a national identity, yeah, sure. But we have seen that's not the case in Europe either. So people always say, yes, I'm both Italian and European, but they will not say, I'm mostly European, and yeah, by the way, I'm from Italy. So it's something that sort of levels it a little bit, that people might see their Europeanness as a common thing, but they would also still keep their national identity for sure. And I don't think that will change. Especially since in all the countries of the region, so starting from Croatia down to Albania, national identity is very much linked with the religion. And it's much more difficult for an individual to switch their religion in a society that's dominated by sort of communal values, sort of patriarchal values. Serbia, special relationships. Yeah, they don't have any special relationships with the European Union as such. In their foreign policy, there is a special relationship towards Bosnia and towards a specific part of Bosnia, towards the Serb entity, and they're trying to build the same thing in their special relationships to Kosovo, although that's a schizophrenic affair by itself, since they don't recognize Kosovo. But they have to sort of build special relationships with a part of a country that they don't recognize. In addition to this, there's special relationships with Russia. And they're mostly built on two things. One is sort of a cultural background on Orthodox Christianity, on common values and whatever that might be. The second is on energy dependency, since all Serbian gas and oil comes from Russia, and Russian firms control all of Serbia's energy production in terms of gas and oil. So there's a very large dependency, also in an economic sense. And these special relationships, I mean, countries in the European Union have them as well. So it's nothing that's sort of extraordinary. It's just that Serbia is not part of the European Union, and specifically, in its constitution says we will never be part of NATO. And this creates sort of a weird, so okay, you don't want to be part of it, but you're buddies with those guys? And I mean, it's not something that's extraordinary, it's just a situation that makes it such. When you don't have close enough ties to the European Union that you can then sort of be seen as a potential threat because of these special relationships. Now, about transition in Bosnia, yeah, it's really an ongoing affair. I mean, you could always speak of the triple transition of Eastern Europe, so society, economy, and the political transition as such. So moving towards democracy, moving towards market economy, and towards a more open and mobile society. In the Balkans, you can speak of a quintuple transition, so 5 different ones, and including sort of a transition from conflict, from war, and also including a transition from sort of a different way of managing resources. I mean, it's a lot more to sort of include in this equation. And you really have this sense that it's something that's not finished yet. The thing that definitely is finished, and you can see it in terms of, be it political leaders, be it societal support, there's no way to go back to conflict. I don't know if that was your question. This transition away from conflict, it's finished. So, and conflict meaning war, in that sense. That's the part that nobody really supports any longer. And there's no structural condition that would make it possible any longer. None of the countries have standing armies. None of the countries have stockpiles of weapons. All of those have been destroyed. So there's no real sort of threat to go back in that direction. The biggest threat is political transition. And that has been slowly degrading. This is the article by Florian Bieber, which basically looks at something that's unfinished. And if you have an unfinished house, it always rains in your house. You have to put a roof on. And that has not been done yet. So, how are Muslims perceived within the country and by themselves? Sort of this religious perception issue. Oh, sorry. So, usually you have this sort of question about trust. And I mean, it's you ask the question in a way that, would you want a member of your family to marry a Muslim or a Christian or something like that? This is sort of this ultimate sort of sign of tolerance. And in that sense, you don't have it at all. A second question would be, would you want your neighbor to be a Muslim, a Christian, and so on? And basically everyone in Bosnia would say, yeah, okay. So in this sort of spectrum from sharing a workplace with somebody of a different religion and sharing family ties with someone from a different religion, most countries in the region fall somewhere in between. They would accept to be together with people from different religions. There's no ghettos or no parts of the city or where they sort of live more divided. And I mean, you can even see this in the European Union, where you have this mostly economically, not politically. You don't have this in the Balkans. How they perceive themselves is sort of a different issue, because especially in Bosnia, but it can go the same as in Kosovo and Albania, religion is very much linked to national identity. So in this sense, being a Muslim would also entail for you being a Bosniak, which is sort of the nationality of Muslims in Bosnia. And being a Orthodox Christian would mean being a Serb. And being a Roman Catholic would be mean being a Croat. So in this sense, you have this sort of perception of yourself as both a religious person, but also belonging to a certain nationality because you are of this religion. And this close interlinkage, it makes it very difficult for people to sort of choose and switch and go beyond this. There are certainly more negative perceptions towards people of different ethnic groups, but not so much more for Muslims than for others. It's for anyone who's not part of your group. So if you were to ask a Roman Catholic Croat, who would you want the least to be part of your family? They would be pretty much equally distanced to a Serb as to an Orthodox Christian Serb as to a Muslim Bosniak. It's pretty much equal in the sense. And you can find this basically across all countries. So the people in Serbia who they feel most animosity towards are Croats, who are basically Christians as well as they are, but of a different type. And it's pretty much sort of mixed, I would say. Republika Srpska, nationalist movements. Yeah, they are in power. So I'm not so certain how much they would influence EU policy as such, because they're the ones who are sort of slowing the country down towards becoming part of Europe. What I would rather expect is sort of a backlash against such nationalist movements to arise in time, and to be a more forceful sort of Europeanization movement, or to put a more forceful Europeanization agenda within Republika Srpska. So if you're speaking of nationalist movements, this would mostly be political parties currently. And this would be the current, he's a Serb member of the Bosniak presidency, Milorad Dodik, who has this nationalist agenda. And it doesn't get much more nationalist than he is currently. So I wouldn't really see them influencing both policy of Bosnia within the European Union eventually at some time, or so much influencing the policy towards the European Union. Because if you ask anyone, any politician in Bosnia, they all support European Union integration. If you ask politicians in Serbia, all except a single party support European Union integration. Everyone in Montenegro supports it, and everyone in Albania, Kosovo, and Macedonia supports it. So there's no real sort of opposition towards a European Union agenda, accession agenda, within any one of these countries. It's just the speed that matters. So once you become closer integrated with Europe, the first thing that you need is much more transparency in your finances, in your policies, in anything that you do. And the second thing is to be more consequent in dealing with deviances, that you need a rule of law that is stable and that you can enforce, so that the courts are not politically motivated, so to say. And the current political leaders, they don't really want that. They want to be a little bit less transparent, and they want to be able to influence the courts. I mean, yeah, that's what they've been doing for a long time. I don't know if it's specifically Balkan mentality. I don't know if it's Southern European mentality, maybe. It's definitely not German mentality. But you can see this sort of push towards being less European from the nationalist leaders currently now, but still they support European Union accession as such, generally. And the last question, how will the three parts of Bosnia-Herzegovina talk together? This was you. Okay. Yeah, they actually don't do that. They have this thing called this coordination mechanism. I mentioned it. It's a policy tool. It basically allows for the three parts of Bosnia to find a way to talk together. So if you would put all three of them in one room, they would first argue for 1 hour and then say something. And if you look at how Bosnia votes within the United Nations, for example, we almost always abstain if Russia and the US don't agree. So we first look at the US, then look at Russia, and if they don't agree, we say abstain, because we cannot make up our mind internally. Now, in terms of talking with the European Union, it's much more technical. There's a few political issues, and you debate about these for months and months, and then come to a common conclusion. But about the technical ones, you try and find sort of a common number on which you can agree on through this mechanism. And then that's your answer, basically. How you answer to the European Union as such. So, yeah, that was a lot of questions. Any more?
Any more? Yes, another one. There. Ah.
So we're here and there.
Thank you for your presentation. I want to ask you about the Chinese influence over the Balkans.
Proceed.
I wanted to ask if you could talk a little more about the relationship between Bosnia and Turkey, and how do you think, what do you think is the difference between the two countries in the relationship between European Union and these two countries?
My name is Pınar. I'm from Turkey, and I want to ask one question about Bosnia and Turkey relations, because Turkey and EU relations don't have any process for now, and this might be bad effect about Bosnia and EU relations, because also you say that one minister of Bosnia, I don't remember which one, but comes to Turkey, and Recep Tayyip Erdogan always goes to Bosnia, and these relations, what do you think about, might be good or bad effect? Thank you.
Okay, that's all.
Okay, so okay, now it's working. So Chinese influence, it's there. So when was that? 2 years ago, 1 year ago, we actually had a huge conference at the University of Sarajevo on the Belt and Road Initiative, sponsored by the Chinese embassy and bringing in a lot of speakers from China to talk about this. It's not so forceful as in other countries. So if you look at the Belt and Road, it doesn't really pass through Bosnia. It passes through Greece and then Macedonia and then Serbia. And you have a lot more influence, a lot more Chinese influence in these countries, especially more economic influence. And while you do have this to a certain extent in Bosnia as well, it's not that prevalent. But you also have these sort of more cultural ties that are being built. So Bosnia is one of the few countries where we don't need a visa to visit China, and vice versa. And you also have a lot of sort of Chinese language institutes popping up, which basically promote a more cultural understanding between the two countries. And I think this is the same for Bosnia and Serbia specifically. These two countries have the same sort of stance and same sort of influence, as cultural influence as well. Economically, you don't really see too much of it yet. Maybe, but it's just not there. It's still pretty vague. Yeah.
Massachusetts, joining the European Union,
It doesn't really influence it in any way. Although maybe it could be that China sees it as a way to influence European policy sometime in the future. Because it's long-term planning, it's definitely there. That the Belt and Road Initiative, it will not be something that's done tomorrow. It's a decade-long generational project. The same as the European integration of the Western Balkans is. And when those two sort of converge together and get finalized together, this could be sort of a place where you can find more Chinese influence within the European Union. But again, I'm not sure about this. The Belt and Road Initiative is still as vague as the European integration of the Western Balkans. Both are not tangible yet. At least not in this part of the world. BIH Turkey, the two questions basically. So one, how is it different to the European Union as such? These relations between Bosnia and Herzegovina, the key difference is economic. If you would look basically at the economic integration of Bosnia and the European Union, it's about 90%. So 90% of trade, and this goes for all the Western Balkans, 90% of trade relations are either between countries within the Western Balkans or towards the European Union. And the rest, these 10%, that's towards everywhere else in the world, including Turkey. So it's measured in hundreds of millions, not billions of euros. And this creates sort of a linkage that's very, very susceptible to political influence. It's not a strong economic linkage between the countries that you have to take care of, that's immediate. It's more, let's make a program and that'll sort of boost our relations together. These differences, apart from economic, culturally speaking, if you would ask people from Bosnia, where do you actually want to go and work and live? Very few would say Turkey. Even though they might feel sort of a connection to Turkey as such, see it as their former occupying empire. This is sort of the Stockholm syndrome of nations, where you sort of feel attachment to your former colonizing empire. It goes anywhere in the world. If you would ask people in Southeast Asia, I don't know, in Hong Kong, Singapore, who do you feel attached to? Will be Britain. The same goes for countries in the Western Balkans feeling attached to Turkey in this sense. We also feel attached to Austria, by the way. They also colonized us. So it goes both ways. Other than that, not too much, no. It doesn't have that big influence. So, and it's related to your question as well, that when you have these, and I mean, one of our former presidents, he's really best buddies with Mr. Erdogan. So they share sort of family festivities together, getting invited to weddings and so on. It's really a very sort of close relationship. And I mean, this influences public perception in a way, definitely. Like you could see this sort of connection between the heads of state of Bosnia and Turkey. And if you would also look at ministerial visits and visits of people who have some position of power, most of them would actually be visits between Bosnian politicians and Turkish politicians. It's the most regular sort of thing that's going on there, much more than any other country in the world. I think the second would be either maybe Austria or Germany behind that, and then Russia. You have this close political relationship that's going on, but I'm not sure how much it influences U.S. accession talks, because Turkish politics still say that the countries of the Western Balkans, and they also have close relations with Serbia, by the way. It's not just Bosnia. They want the countries of the Western Balkans to join the European Union. It's still official Turkish policy. No matter how much Turkey is sort of in a dubious spot currently within of its own European integration, they still sort of support the European integration of all other countries as well. I'm not sure if it's, again, same as in China, for possible future political influence, or just because they too have some agenda to integrate within Europe as such. We'll see. But I don't see it as a negative influence. At least not currently.
Excuse me, but you said that the influence is not so strong now. So why did you say that most of the flights from Bosnia go to Turkey? I mean, if they don't want to go there to live or to work, why do they go there for?
It's not so much why do Bosnians go to Turkey, it's why Turks go to Bosnia. So lots of tourists and also lots of transit flights. Transiting through Istanbul, basically it's the easiest way to get to anywhere east of Istanbul. And that's the main reason. So it's not so much Bosnians as such. Although you do have a large Bosnian diaspora, diaspora, 100 years ago, they left in Turkey with about 2 million Turkish citizens of Bosnian descent. So you do also have this strong sort of feeling within Turkey of being close to Bosnia as such, at least culturally, historically. Yeah?
No, sorry, can you repeat with the microphone because?
Okay.
Thank you. How is the relation with the state who is yet inside the European Union as Croatia, and there is also a border between Croatia and Bosnia, so they are really near. And with Croatia and with Austria, as you said before. Thank you.
Well, the relation with Austria is pretty simple and straightforward, and it's there are very few issues in this relationship. It's more of a everyday working type of relationship. The one with Croatia is much more difficult. It's basically when you want to get into a bar, and the bartender or the guy at the door he doesn't like you too much. Because, he dated his girlfriend or whatever. It doesn't really matter too much. The thing is that this type of relationship is much more difficult. There's a huge border between the two countries. And usually the relations are very well. So economically, and also if you sort of look at it, about 1/3 of citizens in Bosnia actually have Croatian passports. They're citizens of the European Union and of Croatia as such. Because we have dual citizenship, and all Croats could actually request to become citizens of Croatia while remaining citizens of Bosnia at the same time. There are a few issues, and these are these unresolved issues, be it border disputes, be it disputes of economic legacy, that are not addressed. And it was the same problem between Croatia and Slovenia in 2011. I mean, Croatia should have joined the European Union 2 years earlier, in 2011, not in 2013, but Slovenia said, nah, we'll wait until we resolve our common issues. And this probably will also be an issue both for Bosnia, but also for Serbia, possibly for Montenegro, definitely for Kosovo. Macedonia has been unblocked since 2005. Just go back 2005 and remember where you were. They've been waiting ever since, just simply for Greece to say, yes, we accept you with your name. So there's issues that have been ongoing for a long time and that have great potential to slow this down. And it's basically all to the internal politics of these countries. If Croatia says, yes, we'll go along and resolve our differences later, that's fine. But if they decide not to, then nothing will happen. So to end up, maybe I'll have 2 questions for you.
Yes.
Yay. And you can pick and choose either one of them. And I would be interested in your opinion on this. So one is whether the Western Balkan countries are inside or outside of Europe. What's your perception on this? And also whether European Union integration is desirable at all.
Yeah.
Because as we see in countries, especially in Serbia, for example, you have a big question mark whether it is desirable for the country itself. The politicians say it is. The population is not so sure anymore. So, what do you think? Any ideas?
Don't be shy. Enlargement.
Is this something Gilberto talks too much about?
Thank you for your lecture, Professor. I'm Rita from the University of Turin. And about this question, I think that for the other countries outside Europe is a really crisis moment, because seeing the European zone that is fighting with populism is something that get the others confused, because this instability is going outside Europe. And for sure, even if politicians say that it's still a desirable thing, especially for the population, is also harder to understand the real reasons to be part of this kind of Europe. That is also problematic for European itself.
Good morning, I'm Filippo, also from Italy, and concerning the second question, I think that enlargement is desirable from like an idealistic point of view, in the sense that if Europe is something to keep peace, for cooperation, maybe it would be even great if Europe was getting even larger than Europe itself, if everybody was getting inside a supranational institution to cooperate.
But
of course, this brings some kind of problems, because Europe is already struggling for the reason she just mentioned, populism, and also this debate going inside the EU about the structural features of the union. So it's already quite difficult. So involving other countries in all this process might not be at the moment the best thing to do, but of course is desirable for a better future.
For a better future.
Good afternoon, I'm Walter from Italy and I'd like to address the second question. So, is enlargement still desirable? Maybe for Bosnia and Herzegovina, yes, but not for bigger countries like Ukraine or Turkey, because for really simple matter, because they would alter or the balance in the EU institutions. Were in a continent of 1 billion people, and country like Turkey, which is like more than 80 million population, would alter significantly the voting process in the Council and in the other European institutions. So, is enlargement still desirable? Not with this European and institutional framework and structure. Mm-hmm. It's desirable for smaller countries which can be, in a way, more constrained and guided by the European institutions and the more powerful states. It's desirable for bigger states with Europe that is internally striving to stick to the plan of European integration. For me, the answer is no.
What do you think? Okay. Oh. No, there.
For the first question, I personally consider like Bosnia as a European country for cultural and historical and geographical questions. And for the second question, like I don't know if it would be good for Bosnia to be in the European Union, but from what you said about like different religions and how you deal with it, I think it would be a good thing for the European Union to, if you can teach them how to deal with multiculturalism and Muslim people, because it's a disaster in most countries. Just a comment.
Okay. And then we have 5 minutes. Okay.
Good afternoon. Yes, answering the first question, that is for Balkan countries outside and inside Europe. Well, I believe they are inside since they take part in the international processes and international relations processes in Europe. They are an integral part of those processes, and I don't think that Europe equals European Union. Even though they are outside the European Union, this doesn't mean that they're outside Europe. Well, as for the second question, well, my answer is no, and it's not because I'm Russian. It's just the fact that I mean, I have nothing against enlargement in general, but in this case, when you have more countries, you first of all get new problems. I mean, I really like Balkan countries. I've been to Serbia, but this is a very problematic region, and I don't think that Europe, that is now facing very many problems, will be able to cope with new problems. And I think that new countries, there are 28 countries in the European Union. Well, for now 28, okay. But this is really going to hamper the decision-making process, and this is really going to hamper, in my opinion, the integration process, since, there will be new points of view, and, this is what happens actually after the 2004 enlargement. So I think that it's not desirable probably not from the point of view of European integration. As for the position of those countries, so it's a question, so I don't really know. Yeah, thank you.
Okay.
Okay, so thank you for your answers. Basically, these are the same two questions that I asked my students and that I also had in this poll, just phrased in a slightly different way. And from your answers, on the one hand, you could see the region as such being a part of Europe. But then again, this question of enlargement, it's still debatable. And I mean, here you can also see how young people in the region also cope with this today. So most of them do see themselves as part of Europe. But a lot of them know that within the next 5, 10, 15 years, their countries will probably not join the European Union as such. So just to go beyond this lecture, so one of the biggest sort of issues that they face is, will they stay in these countries or will they leave and move to Europe? And within the same survey that we had and that I showed you here in the results of, we had a huge sort of part of the questionnaire which looked at migration. So are you planning to leave your country? Where do you want to go? And yeah, about half of young people are actually deciding and planning to leave the country. So there's a joke in the Balkans, and I want to end with this. In 20 years or so, if the European Union is still there, and the last country of the Western Balkans joins, the European Union leaders will say, basically, yes, congratulations and welcome, your citizens are already here. So we'll leave it at that, and thank you very much.
Thank you.